Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining BoardSmart for a webinar today, Insight, Not Overload, Streamlining Board Reporting. Moving to the next slide. Let's see. Can you move it to the next? There we go. Oh, back one? There we go. In terms of logistics today, we've got everyone in listen-only mode just to block out the background noise, but we do want your questions. Throughout the presentation, if any questions come to mind, just use your control panel. There's a question box there. Just type in any questions that come into mind and we will read them following the presentation and respond. If you're having any audio or technical issues during the webinar, you can call GoToWebinar at 1-800-263-6317. We are recording this session. We will have this webinar replay and the slides posted later today on boardsmart.com. Of course, we encourage you to share this webinar slides and the recording with any colleagues that you may have who may be interested in this. And on the next slide, we can see our agenda for today. We'll do introductions, we'll have comments from CalPERS, INPRS, and then we'll take Q&A. And with that, I'll turn the session over to Rick Funston with BoardSmart for our introductory remarks. Rick?
Thank you very much, Kelly, and welcome everyone to our very first inaugural webinar. Today, we're fortunate to have with us Sabrina Hutchins and Doug Hoffner from CalPERS, as well as Steve Russo, who's the executive director at INPRS. And they'll be sharing with you what their experiences are relative to a kind of a framework that I'm going to just try and introduce to begin with today. So thanks for all of you for joining us, and I'll just kind of kick things off here. Part of the challenge that boards face is that obviously there's a lot at stake. The fiduciaries are subject to the highest standard of care. They have to make a lot of tough decisions, and they're faced with really tsunamis of data that can be overwhelming. So you're dealing with a very highly complex environment that's rapidly changing, and obviously there's a lot of uncertainty. So how do you deal with that? How can we help simplify the way the information is presented? How can it be made more insightful? And how can trustees become more situationally aware? And to do that, we think it would be helpful to have a framework. So some of the challenges that face boards, first of all, is that you may get a board book that's somewhat similar to Tolstoy's War and Peace. The first edition had 1,225 pages, and I've seen some board books that actually beat that by several hundred pages. They also, Tolstoy's book also had 560 main characters. You may have at least as many acronyms that pop up in your board books as well. So how do you make sense of all of that? So in addition to the volume, then, you also have differences in individual appetites for the amount of detail. Some trustees want to stay at a high level, others like to dig down, and they should be able to do that, but it makes it hard for everyone to kind of get the big picture. There's differences in terms of the way people communicate and in terms of the way that they learn. Some are very visual, some like to read it, some like to have it read to them. And at the end of it, as a result of all of this, there can be a loss of situational awareness. And that can be pretty problematic in today's environment. So let's start, though, by talking about what's the job of the fiduciary board. In every situation, for every board, obviously, there's a set of enabling legislation, bylaws, charters, strategies, and policies that kind of lay out what the job is of the board. But what we found is that those often tend to be lists, and long lists can just be confusing because it doesn't really help you understand what are the essentials of the job. So what we've done is we've developed a framework, which we refer to as powers reserved, that has 5 powers. And you'll find that if you go back and look at your enabling legislation and bylaws, you'll see that they can be organized into these 5 main categories. The first one is to conduct the business of the board and its committees. The second one is to set the policy direction the direction and the policy of the organization, and then prudently delegate its execution, because boards just simply are not in a position to do the work, although some may be inclined to want to do so. The next thing is, once you've set the direction, then you need to be able to oversee that it's actually being carried out within policy. The next thing is that there are a number of recurring decisions that come before a board throughout the year that require board approval. And there's a kind of a due diligence process that's required with respect to that. And then the last thing is, of course, is to trust but verify that the information that the board receives and the reports that the board issues are reliable. Now, each one of these is obviously a topic for a webinar on its own, but today what we're going to do is focus on the one that is of oversight. And so when you think about, well, what are the oversight roles of the board? It begins, as I said, with the board setting direction and policy and then delegating its execution. And that means they need to gain insight to oversee that the board approved directions are being executed within policy. They need to have insight into the policy implications of unwanted or unexpected performance variability. And really, what are the range of options that are available to the organization if this variance continues or worsens? And third, to be assured and independently reassured that there's capable people, processes, systems, and resources in place to achieve the expected performance and manage the related risk. Now, I know that sounds a lot like a lot, but we really want to try and focus in on what are some of the ways and some of the tools that can be helpful to boards. So the first thing, though, is to kind of look again at what we mean by oversight. And one definition is to watch over and direct, but not to closely supervise or manage. Ironically, another definition means it's an unintentional failure to notice or do something. And obviously, that's the challenge that trustees face, is how do they avoid unintentional failures to notice or do something? That can happen as a result of a loss of situational awareness, which basically is knowing what's going on in the environment around you. So that can happen because of information overload. It can happen because of selective attention. You get fixated on a certain aspect of performance and don't see changes happening in other aspects of performance, right? You can lose focus. You can get distracted. And obviously, these are things that happen every day in all of the other aspects of our lives as well, and we have to watch that as well. And then, of course, there can be just complacency. You can get used to seeing things and expect that it's just going to continue. Kind of an interesting anecdote is that most mountaineers die on their way down the mountain, not on their way up, because they've relaxed after they've achieved their goal. So oversight is extremely important. So how can we improve situational awareness? And that means, how can we improve the ability of the board to watch over and direct, to improve the resilience and agility of the organization, and to reduce or avoid unintentional failure to notice or do something? So there's really three questions that boards need to ask: what's important, what's changed, and what does it mean? So for that, you need good signal detection, and you're going to hear both CalPERS and INPRS talk about their experience with exception reporting, about when things are exceptionally good or when things are exceptionally poor. How do you bring that to the board's attention? How do you identify where there's a pattern emerging and what's the trend, right? And then how do you understand what are the policy implications of that trend if it continues? And what is the response hierarchy? In other words, what's the least you can do under the circumstances and what's the most you can do? And obviously, your objective is to try and maintain your options as open as possible for as long as you can. But that, again, comes into another issue about how you identify those policy implications. So the other step, obviously, is how do you escalate and when do you escalate when something is beyond what you might normally expect? And you're going to see examples, again, on how to do that. So there's a couple of oversight tools that we wanted to bring to your attention. And that, first of all, the board really needs to understand what are the vital signs for the vital functions, the vital retirement functions that the system performs. And part of our philosophy is that performance and risk are really inseparable, because Performance, is the kind of what is the expected performance of the target, and then what is the actual. And that's where you're establishing, then the board needs to establish what are the tolerances, how much variability are you willing to accept, and how do you use and choose benchmark information. And also the measures that you choose are strategic in their choices. What you measure is typically what you get. And you're going to hear again how both of these organizations are identifying leading and lagging measures and how to try and get ahead of the causes of some of these performance issues. What both organizations are going to present today are examples of heads-up displays or alert systems, right? That are color-coded, that are moving toward more and more automated inputs, that have links to underlying data, that provide dashboards or scorecards. And when I use the term process calibration by management, management has the primary responsibility for making sure that the information that's presented is reliable and timely. But in addition to that, you also need independent verification that the reports that you're receiving as a board are reliable and that you can count on them, because there's nothing worse than finding out that something that you were counting on turns out not to be the case. So one of the things that we're seeing these days is an increase, certainly over the last 5 years or so, there's been a significant increase in the use of portals, board portals. So these are ways that could help boards understand and access a lot of information under uncertain conditions, but they need to be able to, again, have insight into that data so they can see whether or not the actual delegations are occurring within the policy parameters that the board has established. So how do you understand the trends and the policy implications? Should the board stay the course, adjust course, or change course? So one of the challenges that we've got today in terms of the current state of portals is that they're used primarily for what I referred to at the beginning as conducting the business of the board. And this is where you get secure meeting materials and agendas and so on that are, again, housed in a secure environment. But unfortunately, they focused only on the power of conduct and not the other powers. They typically have only rigid, flat files that can't be searched. There's a lack of glossary of terms or subject matter indexes and so on. And it's very hard to print out individual selections. And it also is typically seen as being a clerical responsibility to administer the portal. I think the future state will be where you still have secure meeting materials, but the portal will support the exercise of all of the powers of the board. It's a place where they can go and they can click and choose what they want to focus on, the level of detail that they want. I'll describe that more in just a moment. That it's flexible, and you're going to hear CalPERS describe how they've actually tailored various views to the individual requirements and perspectives of trustees, not just the overall view. It's searchable, glossary of terms, you can print out selections, and it also is seen as a strategic board interface because it's how the executive typically communicates with the board. So just to give you a quick example, when you look at it from the perspective of the trustee or as a committee of the board or the full board, typically the way information is presented today is that you can often get down to the transactional level of detail and the supporting operational information. Now, obviously the board can ask and has the right to see anything that it wants to see, but the challenge is you can get lost in that detail. And so for some organizations, you can have more than 1,000 or 1,500 pages of material that's essentially unsearchable, and prior board meetings and so on are basically like books on a shelf. You have to go through each one of them to find what you want. What we're saying is that in addition to this information and hopefully making it searchable, we need to add some value-added layers to this that allow you to kind of step up to have the board can have more of a top-down view to look at what are the vital retirement functions and the vital signs. And again, you're going to see some very good examples of what both CalPERS and INPRS are doing to present those vital signs to the board. And how do you then reflect that in either exception-based dashboards or scorecards so you have that heads-up display which then management can then say, here's what we're doing about these things, and we're escalating things when they have policy implications to the board. That will, when that information is linked, rather than just being flat files, then you can have value-added insight. You're not taking anything away from the board, you're actually adding a way for them to get more out of it by giving them the big picture with a drill down capability. And as you'll see on the left here, now the organization or the board should be able to improve their line of sight right down to the transactional level of detail. That's not obviously where they should be focused. They should be focused more on the strategic issues. But as I said, they have the right to satisfy themselves that the information is there and it's consistent. So they can oversee the execution and direction of policy. You can drill down and roll up, and as I said, it's searchable. And then, of course, you must trust but verify that the information that you're receiving is reliable. So those are, again, I think some kind of a high-level view of the kinds of things that we would be looking for in a board portal. So to kind of sum it up, in terms of exception-based reporting should improve access to information, it should improve insight for oversight, and it should improve situational awareness. So a board portal then basically should enable all powers reserved, improve insight and access to information, and it should be, again, allow this searchability with the drill downs and the roll-ups for policy agendas, the strategic plan, dashboards, glossaries, policy options, summaries, histories, all of those kinds of things where an individual trustee can go in and choose which information they want to access and when, and to the level of detail. Now, it all sounds great in theory. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sabrina Hutchins and Doug Hoffner from CalPERS to tell you how it actually works. Sabrina and Doug?
Thank you, Rick. Great being with you today and with the fellow panelists and the members of the webinar. So I'll kick it off with the first section, transition to Sabrina, and then I kind of close it out with a couple other lessons learned throughout this process, particularly related to COVID and the pandemic. So let's start with how did we get to where we are today? Our board every 2 years or so does a board self-assessment, which talks about the outgrowth of kind of what they're learning amongst themselves in terms of governance process. We've had approximately 50% of our board turnover in the last couple of years. So we went from, to Rick's point, a process whereby everything was chronological. We definitely had the War and Peace approach. It was at least 1,500 pages a month. We met pretty much every month minus October. And if you were a board member who could basically follow along for the decisions and policy discussions that were happening month after month, no problem. We do have a rule in the state of California that everything must be posted within 10 days of the public meeting. So you got your War and Peace volume, whatever on that weekend, and you had 10 days to read it before the next board meeting. And I think the board members themselves felt quite overwhelmed, frankly. Many of them are appointees and have other jobs and responsibilities. And it wasn't that the answers to their questions weren't there, but sorting through 1,500 pages of material and agendas and attachments is quite challenging for anyone. And frankly, over time, you've got to believe there's going to be burnout there. Based on our self-assessment, the board's feedback, working with us and frankly brought Rick and his team on, we worked with the NACD, National Association of Corporate Directors as well, over time to basically look at what is a better way of conducting the work of the board under the framework that Rick discussed previously. And what you'll be hearing is frankly a lot of the things that he just talked about we've been implementing over the last 3 years or so. One of those things was also, before we could move to less meetings, frankly, and the board felt that that was something that was necessary to do, was making sure we had the level of information and data in a way that could be presented to them earlier than they were getting it before, in a more manageable format, and frankly through a different set of portals. We had currently at that point in time been using Diligent, which is that flat file, which is confidential and protected the information in the closed session material, which is appropriate and great and flexible to at least have the board members see the material without having to print out 1,500 pages of material every month. But it didn't have that searchability and the connection back to understanding policy decisions that may take a year or more to get to the outcome of that were connected and linked and available to basically sort through with that chronology and the glossary, et cetera. And particularly you get into some of those areas where, you know, we all like to use acronyms, but you've got an acronym in a health policy area that's the same 3 letters that's in the investment arena or the actuarial arena, and they all mean different things. And we weren't doing a really good job of sort of self-identifying. We were sort of speaking in you know, the ABC and gobbledygook of sort of governmental bureaucracy in some respects. And so really doing a better job to step away from that and talk about things in terms of the policy content that we're looking to bring forward. One of the other outgrowths of that assessment and that work was really looking at how we build that new system. And what we went forward with was an approach that basically used a customized internally built system based on interviews with our board members, our IT systems, put together a product we were calling Insights. So you've heard that Rick mentioned it a couple times. And that's right now something we've rolled out, and essentially we're posting all publicly available material to the board in a time frame that's a longer duration for them to be able to consume prior to meetings. Those months that we don't meet, it still gets uploaded in an appropriate time frame. So they're always getting the data that they need in order to feel fully connected with the decisions and ongoing activities of the organization, which is serving 2 million members in California. The other benefit of that is that he mentioned pinning and things like that. We're allowing the board members to customize how they see and view that data. While it's all there for them, they have the ability to basically increase or identify the subject areas they may be more interested in terms of measures and metrics and things there for themselves. So our next step will frankly be transitioning to a fully integrated product where we can have both open session and closed session material. Once we finalize all the information security assessments, we'll be doing that, and that'll give us an internally built and branded document and portal system that will allow us to convey that information to the board, and then posting that public information for our members as well, whether we're meeting that month or not. And with that, let me just pause and I'll transition to Sabrina for the next upcoming slides, and I'll circle back at the end to talk a little bit about the pandemic.
Thanks, Doug.
Very good. Thanks, Doug. And happy to be here today to share a little bit about the CalPERS story and expand on some of Doug's examples there. Next slide. So this view here, hold on one second, shows you the overall framework that CalPERS works within. And of course, this aligns back to our foundation, which captures our mission, our vision, and our values, representing who we are and what we want to achieve. And then we have the inclusion of our strategic plan goals, as well as our outcome measures that outline our high-level operational expectations. And then the high-level visual you see at the bottom of the slide is the view of that enterprise performance management system. And I'll say this isn't an official system that you would typically think about as far as a technology platform, but it encompasses the people and the processes that are managing and leading the development, implementation, and ongoing monitoring and reporting of performance metrics that support our mission. So the intent of this system is to reinforce CalPERS' desire to be transparent and accountable in support of our strategic goals and operational expectations. And it also helps and supports the role of the board's oversight needs. It also supports engagement and collaboration, as this information is not only reported to the Board of Administration, but is available and published to the public as well as our internal team. Today, CalPERS is reporting on 27 strategic measures, 27 strategic business plan initiatives, and 64 key performance indicators at the operational level. Next slide. So our focus when we do report to the board are on those items in our forefront, specifically focused on our strategic priorities. So this is the view of our goals during the life of the current plan from 2017 to 2022. And as the EPM system, as we call it, does incorporate a significant amount of data and information, we do provide the board the full details of the strategic and operational insights within each of our quarterly reports. We do maintain a focus when we have these discussions and highlight details in our reports on the strategic side of the house. Next slide. So CalPERS has definitely evolved over the years with our process and our reporting. Prior to the current plan for 17 through 22, we did not have formal strategic measures in place. And our reporting process was not as comprehensive as it is today. We didn't have the red, yellow, and green indicators, and we were probably more focused at the project activity level. And now, with the current plan, we were able to transition and improve those elements and also streamline our reporting structure to have the entire enterprise plan reported to the full Board of Administration. So one of the other things we changed from prior years is depending on what goal we were focused on or what project was being reported, we would go to different committees. So if we had a health committee or retirement committee, I'm sure you're all familiar with that. And so now what we've found is having an enterprise view in one place improves the board's, the full board view of the entire strategic plan, maintaining connection and continuity. And what we find is a lot of places overlap. So this helps improve that overall direction to the team for planning and resource allocation discussions, keeping us all on the same page. So as part of the current plan's implementation, we developed this map view that you see here. We did a significant amount of work with the organization around developing those metrics to demonstrate our progress over the life of the plan. This map shows you that cascading alignment of our strategic goals, our objectives, our measures, and our business plan initiatives at a glance. We also implemented the red, yellow, green indicators with the establishment of baselines, thresholds, and targets. Next slide. And then we go back one slide. Let me go back the other way. And one more back.
Or forward?
So right here. So we went from the map view to the summary sheet detail here. What this shows is each one of our measures and initiatives describes the metric. So it describes why it's important, explains the values as it relates to the targets, the thresholds, and when something would change to red, yellow, or green. It also explains the root cause of why something's off target or at risk and what the team is doing to mitigate those issues. So that is all there in that narrative format, and again, focused on those escalation issues as Rick mentioned earlier. And then the next slide where you see the trend charts. So once we had those metrics in place, a couple years later, we were able to really establish the trending elements. So we were able to capture a visual display of that progress over time. And so that's a nice alignment to continue to improve the visuals and the comprehensive nature of our ability to report. Next slide. So then, evolving again over time, this past year, we were able to take the map, the view that you've seen there, the summary sheets and the trend charts, and transition that over into the digital platform that we're calling Insight. And this gives the board the same data now at their fingertips. And all of these items I showed you were previously part of a 200+ page enterprise performance report. And now the Insight tool houses that particular agenda item. And I know this slide mentions here, 15+ pages, 1,500+ materials. That was what the board used to get in entirety. Now they're seeing more and more of those agenda items and their resources and their calendars all within the Insight tool. So what that looks like as an example, next slide. So here is kind of that equivalent of the map. In place of that map, they can see the goals and measures at a glance. They can see the indicators of red, yellow, or green. And as they scroll down, they see all the various goals. This is just showing you that high level top layer. Next slide. So as they click on that indicator, they can see there for funded status, there's a red indicator. If they click on that indicator, it takes them to additional detail, and you notice here they can see past fiscal year information. Next slide. And now you're seeing that detailed summary sheet. So you're seeing the narrative of the description and information about why the indicator is at risk or off target. And as they scroll down, and if you go ahead and go to the next slide, Rick. They see the trend chart. So all of that is there as through a drill down mechanism for them to review all those details as they need to. Next slide. And then in addition, so now that we've been able to use this tool for a little bit less than a year, we found some additional benefits to having that digital platform. We've been able to take those methodologies and establish additional dashboards for more of an internal usage as well, such as with our executive team wanting to have some operational indicators around various emerging issues. So we're more comfortable with utilizing that data, and as we have more availability, we're able to evolve those views for other opportunities. And so I'll turn it back over to Doug to highlight some of those.
Thanks, Sabrina. So maybe we can go to the next chart as well. We basically use this framework that we developed for the board, and here's an example, but basically roll that up to operational metrics as well that we were using and have been using on a daily basis, if not weekly basis, for all of our COVID emergency response preparedness work since March of 2020, and basically put an operational team together that was enhancing the executive team to meet on a daily basis. Given we had 85% of our employees working off property, and we near over 2,800 folks, we want to make sure they're productive and getting the job done and meeting the expectations of our 2 million members. But we wanted to do that from a data-driven perspective, and so we did this in a variety of things. So here's a benefit payment time in this chart, and you kind of see it over time. But rolling these measures up, and this got down into a variety of other levels as well in terms of how well we were doing. That red, green, yellow approach. This was used at the executive level to really make sure that we were meeting the performance outcomes, and if we weren't, or there was technical issues or otherwise, to really work with our internal teams to make sure we got those addressed and fixed. And if folks had to come into the office to get that work done, then that was fine as well, and meeting the appropriately socially distanced requirements, etc. So it had multiple uses, and we continue to use this now. And frankly, as we just got off a call with our division chief and our CEO about some of these things, we're essentially looking at, as we bring people back in the near future, but in a much more flexible telework environment, again, using measures and metrics to really align to make sure that we're meeting the expectations of that 2 million member population, whether we're on property or off, in a new post-COVID environment. So next slide, please. And this is just another example of that. I think next slide we'll get into the experience of the board. Essentially, the use of the Insights tool has been quite helpful for them. We've got a lot of positive feedback. I think I mentioned briefly earlier, our next hurdle is really transitioning to get the confidential closed session material also converted to that internal portal. Once that is done, then we'll have a standalone tool that we're internally built and managed to provide that content to the board members. And I think from that perspective, it's really meeting the needs that they've helped identify through that self-assessment we've been conducting. From that standpoint, really positive feedback. And I think the challenge now is we're kind of, passing the baton between two different portals at the moment. And so the sooner we can get onto the other one in the relatively near future, we'll have that sort of single place for all of this material to be viewed, consumed, and utilized by the board and through the executive team in appropriate levels within the organization. I think that might be the last slide.
Great, thank you very much, Sabrina and Doug. And I know that Kelly's kind of tracking questions for you, so we'll save those for the end. And now I'd like to turn it over to Steve Russo, who's the Executive Director at INPRS. Steve?
Thank you, Rick. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving up your hour to spend with us today. I have 15 slides I'm going to attempt to do in 15 minutes. My intent is to move quickly. It's great that the slides will be available to you, so I just want to hit the high concepts and maybe on a slide or two, pick out a couple examples in detail just to help illustrate the concepts. I want to give a special shout out today to our Director of Strategic Initiatives, Cheryl Harding, who may be listening in, so I want to thank her and the team for herding us as executive cats and making all this stuff happen. So today I was asked to talk about a tool that we use for measuring and monitoring and disclosing our strategic performance management. And it's a tool that is called the Balanced Scorecard that I'll talk about here in a moment. But I just want to make it clear that this isn't intended to be an overall comprehensive KPI tool. There's other dashboards and other things in place that we use to measure day-to-day operational performance. But this is really all centered around how do we go about measuring and monitoring our performance to our strategic plan. So with that, on the next slide, just a little bit about us, just to set the stage. We're CalPERS times 10% in terms of money and our size of people. We're about $40 billion. Obviously, the markets have been kind to us this year, and I think we're approaching 43. But we're relatively complex in that we have 16 different funds that we manage that serve the needs of close to 500,000 members and a broad employer base of over 1,200 employers. Our board, we are an integrated investment and benefits shop, a single 9-member board that governs us. We merged our systems together back in 2011, and it was an opportunity to hit the reset button on our board governance structure. And so listed here is the current makeup of our board of trustees. But I would characterize us as working in a relatively highly delegated environment. Our board meets about 6 times per year. On average, our meetings are about 4 hours. Our board books on average are around 300 pages, but I would say there's probably a core set of 50 pages that we spend time on during the meeting itself. And just to give a shout out to the testimony of how some of these tools can work, I'm really proud of our team. We've been, back when we first merged around 2011, we were in the middle of the pack when it came to how we were being measured by CEM, both in service and in cost. And year over year, we've been improving in both areas. And so just this past year, we made it to the #1 spot in the CEM service score amongst all the people in their database, not just our peer group. And during that time, we've managed to decrease our cost per member in our DB plan by 30%. And so now we're in the bottom quartile of cost. So this is one of these tools that I believe has helped us get there. Next slide. So this is no magic here. This is a traditional chart that you might see as a very traditional strategic planning process. But I just want to kind of start with this because as I build up to the balanced scorecard, it's important to understand the elements that end up feeding into that. But we have that traditional strategic planning process that starts out with the direction, gets into then the objectives and the projects, so help us understand what we'll do and when we'll do it, and then feeds into the detailed plans of who's going to do what and how we're going to get there. Next slide. So in our strategic planning process, there's an output, and this is a flow of the different outputs that help build the building block for the balanced scorecard approach. To no surprises, most of us have our mission and our visions, our value statements, but one of the outputs of the way that we do the process is this thing called a strategy map that I'll show here in a moment. An outgrowth and that ties in with the strategy map is underlying strategic objectives for each of our strategic goals. So a little nuance as I talk about this, we have in our framework strategic goals, and then we have strategic objectives. And the objectives are the SMART kind of things, the specific, measurable, attainable stuff that are the detailed projects that make up and helps us move and make progress on our goals. And then we have a balanced scorecard then that is really intended to measure how well are we doing on moving the needle on what our top level goals are. which are separate and distinct from how well you might be executing a particular project or how well you might be executing on a day-to-day basis on an operational matter. And then an important box that could be its own little webinar someday, and that's about the risk assessment piece at the bottom. I'm a big believer in risk assessment. And when it comes to strategic planning, always reminding myself that for all of us as we do our strategic plans, there's at least two kinds of risk. There's risk of the plan itself, and then there's a risk to the plan. And that differentiation being in that you can come up with a plan and you can execute that plan perfectly, but if you chose not to do the right things to begin with, then you can still fail. And so it's really important as you do strategic planning to be sure that you look at risk, in my opinion, through at least two of those lenses. So next slide. So I'm not going to go through these in detail. It's not important necessarily what they are, but if you were to look at these are our 9 high-level strategic goals that we have. And by design, there's a mix of these that get into our people, our delivery of service to our stakeholders and our members, how our investments are doing, how we perform financially, and then where we are with risk. So these 9 goals are part of this map that I'll be showing you here in a moment. So next slide. So on this slide, this is just a cut and paste of something out of the Harvard Business Review. I won't make today a history lesson on the balanced scorecard approach. This isn't something we invented. It's been around. I think the origins at least are documented back to the late 80s of a gentleman at a company called Analog Devices. He ended up getting connected up with a professor at Harvard Business School, an outside consulting firm that culminated in an article in a paper that got published in the Harvard Business Review in 1990. And then it's a tool that's been evolving over the years, up and through several generations. It was the second generation of this that created the thing I'll show you here in a moment called a strategy map. And then the third element that was put on towards the end of the evolution of this tool is this thing called a destination statement. So next slide. So in the balanced scorecard approach, there's these things, I call them elements here, but if I had been true to the way that the program was put out there, these are called different perspectives. And so there's 4 perspectives in a balanced scorecard approach. And so you're almost forced by design of the tool to be sure that you're being balanced and how you look across 4 different elements, those being financial, those being customer, learning and growth, and then your business processes. Next slide. So this is a culmination of how all of this stuff ties together for us, and it's called our strategy map. And I'll make note at the top, one of the things that we were challenged to do as we were pulling together the strategy map was to try to come up with what is known as a destination statement. It's if you really had to capture where it is you're trying to go in just a couple words, what would it be? And so for us, we coined internally the phrase "we're trusted to pay," and that the key measure of that being our funded status. Then below that, you see the different colored boxes. Each one of those boxes represents one of our 9 strategic goals, and they're broken out by the 4 different elements, being member, stakeholder, customer focused, the middle being financial, those that are process related. And then an important distinction I think is so important graphically that is shown here is that our people, which is the yellow at the bottom, is the foundation of everything. And then over on the right-hand side, you'll see a red bar, which is one of our goals, which is proactively managing risk. That is just inherent in everything that we do across all the different aspects. So with that, next slide. I'm going to go through these in detail. These were the 24 different measurements that we landed on for our current dashboard. I want to maybe mention that in our case, we do strategic planning. It's an annual process. We look 3 years forward, but update the plan annually. And we will make changes to the things that we decide to include in this scorecard each year, depending upon how our strategic plan is changing. One of the things I'll highlight here too is that if you know the traditional approach, if we read the literature on this, it has the 4 perspectives. For us, we added a 5th perspective, and that being enterprise risk. Next slide. What I'm going to do is quickly move to the next slide and use the next slide to walk through the different elements that make up our balanced scorecard. So if we move to the next slide, the next few pages are going to be eye charts and may be difficult to read on your screens. But this is essentially the scorecard / dashboard that we use and look at internally, as well as gets disclosed to our board at every meeting. And you'll see for each of our measures that we purposely be sure that every measure ties to a goal. And then we also want to be sure that every goal has at least one measure associated with it. We identify an E-staff champion or executive staff champion for this. We take the approach here that we collectively as the executive leadership team and really every employee here at INPRS is responsible for this. But we do pick a person to be the cheerleader for each of these items. We try to identify if the measure is a leading or lagging indicator. We'll talk about that here in a moment. We actually have the measure itself. We set a target for it. And then you'll see the solid colors where we've set a threshold of the actual measurement itself. And that will turn red, yellow, green like a traditional stoplight. But then next to it, we have a trending box where we will show the trend of the last 3 reporting periods. And then we will put a color around that to denote how the trend is going. And where this is really important is that what we really try to do is kind of look at this like the check engine light on your car. We would like to be able to see something turn a color that might give us an advance notice on the trending before we get into a less than green color on our actual measurement status. And so, for example, on this slide, I'll talk about our member satisfaction when it comes to our call center. A great example of one where in this particular case, you can see that we're trending down, yet we're still green, but nonetheless sets a light off to say, hey, what's going on with the trend? You know, what's going on? What can we do before we get to a point where that measurement goes other than green? This is also another type of measure, using an example, member satisfaction when it comes to our call center. We measure, we have an independent third party who reaches out to interested sample size, those that interact with us at 5 different places, one of them being our call center. And traditionally, a lot of us will measure how long it takes for our people to wait, maybe to get to somebody, and that's one of the key measurements that we'll look at when it comes to our call center. But what we've learned is through all the data analysis, and really should be no surprise, is that what really drives member satisfaction in the call center isn't necessarily how quick somebody picks up the phone. What really drives that is how knowledgeable is that person that does eventually answer the phone, whether it's in 5 seconds, 30 seconds, or 2 minutes. And you can pick up the phone quick, but if they don't get a good answer, they're not going to be satisfied. And so this is one where today we have this lagging indicator for call center satisfaction, but perhaps in our future state model, we might say, you know what, if it really is a driver, that we have knowledgeable people on the other end, maybe a good leading indicator might be to measure the level of training or years of experience that our call center staff have, because that might be the indicator then of our members getting the answers that they want. So again, just an example of using the call center satisfaction. So next slide. Here, these are our financial ones. The only one I maybe highlight here is kind of to a second one from the bottom. It's an interesting measure that we put in place. We all have all kinds of ways that our investment teams measures investment performance. But from a strategic perspective, we want to have insights as to when do we start to run into the risk of our employer contribution rates having to go up. So each year after we do our actuarial analysis, we calculate what those financial investment returns would have to be over the course of the next year for us to at least hit without having the risk of our employer contribution rates going up. So we have a measurement that's geared around that. So it's a little bit different than your traditional measurement that the investments teams might give in their scorecard or performance to the board. Next slide. I won't really take much time here. Again, these are just the example of our process-driven ones. Maybe a nuanced one here, it drove some interesting discussion in the early days of this, is our goal 7 down there about ensuring that we have a value-based and competitive operating cost structure. So this really gets down to how much are we spending to deliver our service and being sure that we're delivering value and how we spend the money. One might naturally think that this is a financial element, but we got to the point where really this became part of process, because where we spend our money on operating comes out of our investment returns. And it's ultimately that investment return is the ultimate financial measure that then drives our ability to be trusted to pay our benefits. Next slide. And I'll just, make a mention here, about us adding in the managing enterprise elements. For us, there's some of these numbers that, you can pull out of a system and do a lot of work on. But then there's a couple of them that are kind of squishy, but nonetheless important. We have one, for example, where, we'll see where we are with our compliance program. And it's kind of an all or nothing kind of a thing where, if there's any exception where we find through our compliance program that we were out of compliance with something, that'll immediately just trigger that to go red and make that an exception thing that we'd want to disclose and talk to the board about. Next slide. And so the next steps for us are kind of really moving closer to where maybe CalPERS is, and they continue to go through and try to get to where we're trying to increase the automation of the data that goes into it, being able to drill down. I'll also use as an example too of being able to apply more sophisticated statistical analysis tools to the data, using the call center as an example. A lot of us will traditionally measure the average, but I'm of the opinion, right, that customer service is done one customer at a time. A customer doesn't experience the average, they experience what they experience. And so maybe more important to that measure is not the average, but what is the variation or the standard deviation around that particular metric. So in the interest of time, I will call it to a close for me and leave some time for some questions.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was very informative. I'm just wondering, Kelly, do we have any questions from the audience?
We do. Let me get to the question and answer. Maybe we can move to the next slide. If anyone has any questions, just as a reminder, just type them into your question box on the control panel and I will read it out loud, and one or several of our presenters can take a shot at answering the questions. The first one is, what roles did the board or board committees play in development of these new reporting systems and in determining which metrics to feature?
Okay, Sabrina, Doug, do you want to go first?
I'm happy to. So basically, we were using, we've been using all our strategic measure performance and the development with the full board of administration. So that's the full 13-member board. We did a lot of this other work through the board governance committee. And so some combination of that, of bringing the metrics and measures together, is always something we've done, usually in sort of a facilitated, typically at offsites and other sort of little more social friendly environments, and less just at the dais, but really trying to break them out into small groups by subject matter, but really done with a full board's participation, given I think that's one of the most fundamental things that they're responsible for in their role. And we've been using that practice for basically decades.
Great. Sabrina, anything to add to that? Okay, how about Steve?
He captured it. That's
okay, good.
Well, I would just generally characterize us as, I go back to when I walked in the doors here in 2008, and before taking on the role, I was given the opportunity to actually, sit in and watch a board meeting. And, meaning no disrespect to, those that may have come before me, but I counted at least 2 board members who fell asleep during the meeting. And it was kind of hard to watch. And so it was, we had a lot of room to grow. And so through that, the commitment I made to the board at the time was, we need to make these board meetings more meaningful, more engaging. And so let's work together to get there. And so, I would say generally speaking, what we've done with the balanced scorecard was staff driven, staff initiated. but the board's been brought along the way and has an opportunity every year, at least every year, to weigh in on the things that we choose to measure and all sorts of things that we do through our strategic planning process.
Great. Kelly?
Great. Our next question, how often do you plan to review and potentially update or modify the system?
Steve?
Well, so, you know, if I'm sure I understand the question right, so as a matter of process, we annually, at least annually, take a fresh pair of eyes at everything that we do. Now, when you look at the underlying system that we have, I would say, you know, we're somewhat bought into the balanced scorecard approach for how we approach our strategic management piece of the puzzle. It's worked for us. We'll, from time to time, always keeping our eyes out for what other better tools and ideas that people may have. Not afraid to look at those and incorporate those. But I don't know, hopefully that answers the question.
No, thanks.
I would say, I would add from a tool perspective, because we publish within the tool quarterly and it's fairly new, we're looking at new functionality and how to best display that on a regular basis. So we think the tool will evolve. As far as what we're measuring, we do an annual review of that formally to make sure we're measuring the right things.
Great. Kelly, any other questions?
Yes, the next question, do you measure the board use of the materials and how it adds to better questions and outcomes?
I'm happy to jump in. We do not. Yeah, we do not. Just like using the current, either whether the Diligent portal or the one we've built, we are not monitoring the board's or the executive usage of that tool. The information is made available in public for those other documents, but no, we do not monitor that. We have, you know, received definitely feedback, so you can tell when there's particular items come up, or we're basically pushing out new enhancements, so we're letting them know there's new functionality. Typically, that's very much in response to questions they've raised. We're trying to see greater connectivity to policy items. So typically, it's a lot in that back and forth, really trying to enhance the tool and the information they're getting and trying to be responsive to that. But no, we do not monitor their activity.
Steve?
I would say the same for us here at INPRS as with, you know, what CalPERS is at.
Okay, great. Kelly, you got time for one more?
We do have one more. Do you have any advice to anyone who's looking at getting started? What are sort of the first steps to changing your systems?
Okay. Sabrina, you want to take the lead on that one?
I think being open to small improvements, kind of baby steps along the way, getting people comfortable with the culture of just measuring and then putting that out for public viewing is kind of a process of evolution. And so I think having those small wins, getting people comfortable with new processes and communication and reporting, and then adding to that and involving people throughout the organization, throughout the process.
Steve?
You know, I echo what Sabrina said. I would just say, you know, don't be afraid. Start small and simple. I mean, we started this journey in 2015. You know, I would suggest starting with something that you know can be that win. But be mindful of what you do pick, because if it's something that's new and different, you know, chances are it will get a lot of attention. A lot of people will care about it. So be sure you kind of pick something that's meaningful. But yet, you know, I would say you have a high likelihood of having success with, and because what you want to try to do is prove out the concept and that the tool can work, as opposed to necessarily the outcome that you get on any one particular item.
Okay. Doug, you want to add anything to that?
I was just going to echo Steve, is like, don't be afraid to start. You've probably got a fair amount of information you're already monitoring internally, sharing that out. I think you're right that, you know, sort of quick wins, but at least, you know, understand what you're identifying, what you're sharing out, making sure it's making sense. But yeah, just don't be afraid to do it. And I think there's hesitancy in many respects, either internally or with others. But you know, you trust the culture, trust your organization, the team, but don't be afraid to start, because you're not going to get anywhere if you don't. And I think there's great opportunity for improvement. And then I think Steve's mentioned this as well, is look at others, right? These are all, we're public facing organizations. All the stuff we've done is basically public. You know, reach out, you know, through associations, your friends, your peers. We're here to help. It's all publicly available. We could tell you the the trials and tribulations we've gone through, maybe some lessons learned that we'd like to share with others in terms of experiences, and I think those have been reflected by many of our peers. So happy to help in any way.
Great. And there's one thing that I would just say is it's probably not a bad idea to start with where is the board feeling the pain of the information overload, or where is there confusion? Where can you make life simpler for them so that you're responding to a need that they've identified that would say, here's a pain point for us. How can we get better information and better insight on this particular topic? And consistent with what everyone's been saying, start small, but start on something where there is actually value added to be gained from that the board will see that, yes, this has been helpful to us. And that way they'll want to use it. Going back to the question that Kelly was raising, is that, if it's useful, they'll use it. But Kelly, how's our time?
That's our last question, and we are at the top of the hour, so you can close it out, Rick.
Terrific. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Sabrina and Doug and Steve. It was very helpful. We really enjoyed your presentations, and we look forward to the next one on risk assessment, Steve. Great. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Please let us know, and we're happy to follow up anytime. Thanks again. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.